everybody, to our first Rector's Forum of the 2024-2025 program year. I missed this over the summer. This is one of the highlights for me each week, getting to talk to our various guests and learning more about the world and about God. And today, to begin our Rector's Forum program, we are blessed to have one of our own, Walker Richmond, who is a public school educator. He teaches history and government at Western Albemarle High School, so maybe some of your kids might have him one day. Children. And he's here with us to talk about how he approaches teaching government and history in these polarized times that we live in, how we think through difficult issues in our civic life. And you know what? Maybe we'll learn about some practices that would be good for adults, too, and how they engage in political discourse. What do you think? Maybe? All right. So we're starting with an activity. And Walker, would you tell us a little bit about what we've done here and what you're hoping to achieve with this activity?
Justin, thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. And Amanda, thank you so much for having me here. It's really, I'm honored to be able to talk to the group and talk a little bit about what I try to do in my classroom. And I'm going to open with this activity. Thank you to those of you who offered responses. I got a pile of responses already. And so I want to read you some of our thoughts about this question. Should the coach of a public high school football team be allowed to pray on the 50-yard line after the team's game? Yes, as long as it isn't mandatory. Yes, if he doesn't make a big deal about it. Allowed, so long as the prayer is completely by invitation, not required, and will not play a role in the team or the school's decision-making in the future. The students who do or do not participate should not be treated any differently based on their decision. So it sounds like the group has reached a consensus that yes, this is allowed. Except, can I read some more answers? No. Separation of church and state. No. If the coach wants to do it off the field after the game, yes. But it has to avoid the appearance of a sanctioned or sponsored event. No. If a student did not believe in God, or if the student didn't worship in the same way as the coach, I feel it could be troubling or confusing to the student. It doesn't feel fair to mix religion into a public school activity, since we have a practice of no church and state. This next person wrote an answer that I love because I'm not sure if this person comes out as a yes or a no. Here's the response. The coach and their team are free to pray silently anytime they want. It depends. Is the prayer taking place immediately after the game in public as an official part of the event? Or privately after the spectators have left? Does the coach confer favor or privileges on players who pray? Does he encourage others to pray or just welcome those who choose to join? I love it when students write questions in response to my questions. That's one of my favorite. You'll actually see my discussion goals, and one of my discussion goals is asking lots of questions. This person wrote a question. This person wrote, is this a culturally responsive practice? And the last one I'll read, I've often wondered this about a public university as well. The coach is allowed to pray but cannot mandate prayer, although that is tricky because some players might feel obligated to pray. So Justin, I started with this activity because what I have found in my career as a teacher is that when you pose hard questions to a group of students, it can be hard to generate a dialogue because people, if you pose a difficult question like this, people might be reluctant to go on the record, okay? You might look at this question when you walk in this morning and you think, I don't know, what's the right answer? Like, there must be a right answer, right? This is kind of, when you go into math class and 3 times 3 equals 9. Well, if a student sees a question like that and feels like, oh, well, there must be a right answer, or there at least must be an answer that all the other people in the group would share, and then that student's probably going to be reluctant to publicly share. And so what I'll do sometimes is I will try to generate this or start the dialogue with this anonymous exercise. And I think it's a place where anonymity can really be helpful in starting the dialogue. One reason is that I've now shared several of these responses, and it's clear there's a variety of perspectives about this question. And now that we know that as a group, we might feel more comfortable going on the record. Because we know that there are people in the room who share our outlook on this question. It's been established by these anonymous note cards. And so I have found that this can be a really helpful way to sort of get the conversation started. And there's one other trick I'll mention with this, which is James Madison, when he wrote the Constitution, or when he and the framers wrote the Constitution, they gave us this tool. Tommy, we're going to study it next week. And it's called federalism. And federalism is the idea in the U.S. government and other governments that different decisions are made at different levels of government. So in the United States, we have some decisions that are made by the national government, some that are made by the state governments, and then some that are made by the local governments. And that is really helpful as a teacher because let's imagine I put a question on the board that's even more sensitive than this question, where if you got into the substance of responding to the question, it might make people uncomfortable or unwilling to share. A tweak that I can make to this exercise is ask the same question, but instead of your substantive response to the question, I say, who should be making this decision? Who should answer this question in our government? Should this be the national government that decides for the entire country? For every public high school in America, there's one answer? Or should each public high school get to make their own decision? Because there might be different social consensus in different communities. And so then we get to think about federalism, and it sometimes can be a way into a question that's almost too sensitive to address straight on.
That's really very interesting, Walker. And one thing that strikes me in this exercise that I think is very, very valuable that you were getting at is that there is a danger of groupthink, right? Maybe a few very vocal students stand up in the class and they say, well, this is the answer to this question. It's a separation of church and state issue. It's clear. There should be no prayer. And if there are other students who maybe feel a little bit more ambivalent about the question, they might feel like, well, I guess that person is kind of the leader. I'm going to follow along with them. And before you know it, everybody in the group is vocalizing the same opinion. And there really isn't deep reflection then. There isn't a deep conversation. And I wonder if perhaps that's a danger that happens often in our own civic discourse as adults, because we don't engage in activities like this that allow anonymity.
I love the way you're framing that, because groupthink is real. It's certainly real in a high school classroom. But it's also real in our society. And in America, there's data that show that more and more we are congregating with those who have similar ideological perspective. So groupthink is real.
So let me shift gears a little bit and ask you sort of a broader question. What sort of topics and issues related to government, public policy, politics are your students bringing up in class? What's of interest and concern to them?
The generation that's in their teens and 20s is very, very interested in climate change as a political issue. And that is one that we talk about a lot. And what is the role of our government at its various levels in addressing climate change? That is probably the single biggest one that I can rely on coming up. Violence in schools is a huge one. And kids who go to school with the periodic stories about school shootings, they're thinking about that, and they want to know, well, if the current adult generation doesn't sort of address this crisis, then what are we going to do? Once it's our turn, like what can we do? So if I had to pick a couple, I would say climate change and school violence. I will, if I can, one of the things I wanted to talk about is one of the themes in my class that I try to use to bring people together is, and I introduce it on the first day of class, it's the idea that the vast majority of Americans share certain ideals when it comes to politics. And one of the ideals that the vast majority of Americans share is this strong belief in individual liberty, that's part of what it means to be an American, is that you believe in freedom. And then another ideal that's very embedded in our history, and I would argue vast majority of Americans believe, is we want to strive for the collective good. So if we all believe in individual liberty and we all believe in the collective good, why do we have so many arguments about everything? And what a thing we come back to over and over throughout the year is, well, what happens is those two ideals come into conflict or tension, okay? There's all these pressure points where you have to decide what is the proper balance between the individual liberty and the collective good. And as a society, we're never going to reach full agreement on those, how the precise precise decisions, but the beauty of democracy is if we can do it the right way, we can agree on the foundational ideals, and then we can work through some of those disagreements. Because if you can see that the person across from you has those two ideals, but they're balancing them in a different way than you're balancing them, then that's at least the beginning of a connection.
Well, I'm wondering how your students, and I'm imagining you introduced this sort of prism or this lens for them, as they think about something like climate change, which you said is very important to that generation. Well, on the one hand, you could say that liberty, depending on how you conceive of it, means that people have the freedom to live the life they want to live, to make their own choices without governmental interference. But on the other hand, you could argue that that sort of outlook could endanger the collective good when those choices are not to the benefit of the collective good. Where do your students kind of come out on that? How do they wrestle with that tension as you're talking about it in class? And are there sort of insights that you think we as a society could benefit from in that conversation?
Well, they certainly don't all agree, but I think a point where there is shared agreement amongst the young people is that our current politics, certainly on the national level, maybe less so on the local level and even the state level, but certainly on the national level, there's way too much energy put into bickering and dragging the other down, and way too little energy put into problem solving. So I think that's one with both climate change and shootings in schools. I think that whether my students are liberal, conservative, or somewhere in the middle, they all have this desire for politics that's more about problem solving.
And yet the adults can't do that, right? They can't seem to come together. So what's your sense of that? I mean, is it that these high schoolers are just not aware of the complexities of what it would take to actually solve these problems in our very bureaucratic system, or do they have a different attitude? Like, yes, we have our different beliefs and our different values, but we're going to find a way forward. We're going to compromise. Are they coming at it from a different point of view than our politicians?
Well, I think there's a habit that our national politicians have lost that I try to work on with the students. And it's basically a habit of empathy and of shifting your perspective. So the skill that it's like we, as a society, we just all need to practice it so much more is you believe something. Now practice thinking and verbalizing and articulating what someone across the table would say if they disagree with you. And that has to be a habit. You have to, there's just so much sort of jumping into, we disagree on this. And I think a lot of it is just not taking the time to look at the other perspective. So I'll try to illustrate this with a story from class this week. We were looking at some clips from the presidential debate. And I showed this clip where the moderator fact-checked former President Trump. President Trump said something, and the moderator responded by saying that what you just said is not accurate based on our reporting. And so it's kind of a dramatic, if you watched it, it's kind of a dramatic moment in the debate. And so I posed a question to the students. Is this the proper role for the debate moderator? Or is that the role that Kamala Harris needs to play because she's the one debating former President Trump, not the moderator? And one student's hand shot up real quickly. And she beautifully explained why it was the moderator's job in that particular specific moment of the debate to correct something that former President Trump said. And she was very convincing. So I said to the class, I said, okay, we clearly have a good explanation of that perspective. And I was very thankful to the student. And I said, but the discussion obviously can't end there because we're reading in the media. A big part of my class is that students also develop a habit of following the news. We're reading in the media, some people were very upset with the moderators. And they said, why are the moderators interjecting themselves into the debate? So we need to figure out that perspective. And I said, can someone please explain to me the rebuttals to what we just heard from your classmate? Total silence. And I think because she had so persuasively and eloquently explained the argument, other students were like, whoa, I'm not going to go there. So I said to the student, I said, okay, so now we're going to practice a skill that we will work on throughout the year. I said, you clearly have thought about it from this perspective. I'm going to give you a minute to think, and I want you to come up with the strongest arguments against the argument that you just shared. So I'm going to ask you to rebut yourself. And boy, if she didn't do it. I mean, her explanation on the other side of the argument was stronger than her explanation on the other side of the argument. And there it was. It's like, yeah, clearly her initial, and I explained this to the group. I said, this is great because you all felt the passion in her initial answer. But like as a group, we've got to get in the habit of looking at the other perspective. And she's done it for us. And we can all do that. So that is a habit that, again, as a society, I would love for us to work on.
And I'm wondering, what you're saying in a sense is that you teach your students critical thinking. But how much of that is happening for our students? Are they, in general, being taught to be critical thinkers, or is the system structured in a different way?
I think American educators, based on the structures that they are given, and this goes for both private and public schools, I think American educators do an amazing job. I think structurally there's a lot of things that we could do differently to support teachers, to teach more critical thinking. But I think with what we've got, I see students come through the system who can really think deeply. So I guess my answer to your question is yes. Education and sort of approaches to education is always going to be a contentious issue. I mean, and you feel, as a parent, you feel it. Like it's so personal. Like you want the kids who are teaching, you want the people who are teaching your kids to do it the right way. But there's a lot of different opinions about how that looks.
We started with a First Amendment question, an issue, we should have mentioned this probably, that was a real issue and was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, if I remember correctly. And I don't remember what the actual numbers for and against it were, but I believe the Supreme Court sided with the coach and said that he did have a First Amendment right to pray.
And that was a significant.
Yeah.
It didn't overrule any existing precedent, but it certainly changed the trajectory of the proper balance between, on the one hand, individual liberty to express your religion, and on the other hand, having a public school environment that does not in any way endorse religion.
Right.
So the Supreme Court split on this decision. It was 6-3. Just like in our group, there was no consensus, and the jurisprudence got modified a bit.
Right. Well, so I'm wondering how you, as a Christian, think about your work as a public school educator, somebody who's teaching young people about government, about history, about being an American, how your own Christian perspective shapes what you do.
Well, I love that question. I think the reason I'm a teacher is because of my Christian beliefs. I feel like that's, working with young people is the place where I can try to make an impact for the good in accordance with my Christian beliefs. So, in a big picture, it sort of has shaped my career decision. I think you might have to tell me, but I feel like there's, in the Bible, there is a thing where, does Jesus at one point say we should all be more childlike?
Yes. Yeah.
He does?
Yes.
Okay. I thought so.
Yeah.
Because I guess I agree with him on that point. Like, we all need to be more childlike, and I feel like there's so much we can learn from young people. But the problem is, as you grow up, there's less and less time to be a child. And so I love my job because I get to, because I'm interacting with young people all day, I get to be childlike. And I think they shape the way I think about things, and they keep me very curious.
Are there particular sort of principles or values or ideas that you see in young people, or sort of a childlike perspective on the world that have influenced you?
Yes, it's. I think in general it's a more sort of hopeful and more optimistic perspective, and it's also a less judgmental perspective, so that students are more accepting of difference, and they're more open to possibility, and so yes. If I had to put it in one word, I would say sort of optimism. And that's not across the board. There's some students who are struggling with some real stuff, but I do see a lot of optimism in the classroom.
A more generally positive or hopeful perspective on the world. One last question, then I'll open it up to the group. So you've talked a little bit about how your Christian faith informs your work, how it inspired you to become an educator. Do you ever find, I'm curious, do you ever find if there are any tensions between being a Christian and then functioning as an educator in a public setting? Do your students ever feel any tensions with their own Christian faith and then what they can or they feel open to doing in a public school setting? Does that ever come up or not so much?
It does, because there's moments where I would like to speak in a more forthright way to a student about a situation, and typically this is not in the full group setting, but like if I'm talking to a smaller group of students or one-on-one, there are probably moments where I would like to share things about my own perspective, and some of it sort of like a Christian perspective, and I hold back because I don't feel like that's my role. But that's something I struggle with, because I think there are moments where I don't know. Right. Yes, I struggle with that. And in general, I decide to withhold my own perspective because I think that's more of my role.
All right, well, let's open it up to questions. Oh, ready? Nathan, yes.
Hi, so your philosophy seems to be founded on the idea of people arguing in good faith based on a shared set of agreed upon facts. But in our politics today, we're increasingly seeing people who argue, or appear to argue, in bad faith, and who are at best indifferent to the truth, and at worst wish to assert power over the truth, to say what I say is the truth, whether or not that's a basis in fact. How does that affect how you lead discussions and work with your students? Because it seems like they wonderfully are arguing in good faith based on consensus facts.
I mean, that's one where I feel like there are moments where I do swallow what I would honestly like to say in response to certain statements, for example, that are made. And I guess it's a little, I mean, it might be a little bit like the question of whether or not the moderator should inject himself into the presidential debate. At this moment in my career, I don't think that's my role. To say things in as blunt a way as sometimes I feel like maybe I should. But I struggle with it. I do struggle with it. I think one thing I said, we really try to develop a habit of media literacy, but just a general habit of following the news and following current events. And so we talk a lot about, well, where are you getting your news and where are you getting your opinion journalism? And we have a couple of beautiful charts that have charted out hundreds of different media outlets on axes, one axis of reliability and another axis of ideological bias. And so that's one way I can do it. I can say, like, let's look at where you're getting that particular fact or that particular spin on the facts, and let's see what this organization says about where that might come from. So that's a way I can try to remove myself a little bit from it.
Other questions? Yes, Chris. Or, no, sorry, Beth.
Oh, just partly for a little background. Is your class a required course or is it an elective? And then I like your number 3 because I was going to ask if you talked about respect in your course.
Respectful and inclusive?
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask if you talked about respect with the students just because I think it's lacking so much in our society today. But I partly wondered if your class itself was a required course or an elective.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. At Virginia's has a law that high school students have to take a class in civics or government to graduate. And yay, Virginia. In the public system, they take that typically as a 12th grader. And at Western Albemarle, there's 2 options. There's an AP government, and then there's a standard government. But everyone takes government. And our culminating project at the end of the year is a project that was developed by my colleague 15 or 20 years ago, Molly Miracle. And it's called Model Congress. And every senior at Western, we spend basically a month and a half or 2 months doing this. Every senior chooses a topic, writes a proposed law on that topic, and then we actually conduct Congress. We do committee hearings, and we do the House and the Senate, and it's just a beautiful project where we kind of put it all into action. The second question about respect.
Yeah.
Yes, this is, when I meet with the parents at curriculum night, I explain that goal number 3 is, to me, the most important goal. As an educator, I want them to grow academically, but growing as a person is, end of the day, is the most important. And in the classroom, what that looks like is we have a project that we point out when people are respectful to each other and all the different ways that looks. And I stop class and I say, did you see that just happened? That was so respectful. And it can be as little as like nodding or, oh, I really liked what James just said and using the name, but we definitely practice the respect piece. That's a huge part of it.
Yes. Wow.
I can probably answer this, but dialogue versus argument. Dialogue being, you and I can disagree on something, but have a meaningful dialogue. I keep thinking back to Sam Rayburn and Cocktail Hour back in the 50s when they'd all get together, Republicans and Democrats.
You're not dating yourself at all, Bob.
Oh, okay. Or Reagan and O'Neill. I mean, they had nothing in common, but they had respect for each other. Do you discuss that at all? Because you're a history teacher, besides being a government teacher.
Yeah, I guess it's like a lot of things where it's kind of a balance, because sometimes argument can actually feel good when you feel a little bit of passion. That can actually mean, okay, this matters. Like, I actually feel about, like, let's say a student on our original religion question has a strong position one way or the other. Yes, we're going to have a dialogue about this, but if a little passion comes into it, that can be okay.
Well, I'm not talking about, I agree with you 100%. I'm talking about where it gets ugly.
No, exactly, and that's where it's a balance, because there's clearly a line where it becomes personal, and you can't practice that empathy skill. So yeah, we talk about that, and we try to find that right balance. Because some of the best classes are when we talk about a contentious subject, and there is some passion interjected, but it's done in a respectful way.
I wonder if we can maybe frame it this way to say that a lot of arguments, conversations are not so much about figuring out a deeper perspective or figuring out the truth, but are more about winning. Can you best your opponent, right? I mean, let's take our presidential debates. They're not dialogues.
Right.
They're not even arguments in a productive sense. They are, can you best your opponent? Doesn't matter what the truth is, can you best your opponent? And so it's, commentators talk about it, right? It seems to me that what you're saying is you're trying to do something very different, which is you can have a strong view about a topic. It can matter to you personally. But there's an openness to trying to figure out the truth as you understand it, to get to a deeper perspective. And that means an openness to actually listening to the arguments and ideas of the other person, maybe synthesizing them with your own, maybe coming to a different conclusion. That's a very advanced skill, but I hear you trying to inculcate that in your students.
And that goes back to the Christian point from earlier about being childlike.
Yes.
Because I think part of being childlike is that openness.
Yeah.
Like, there's different ways of thinking about this. And young people, I think, they aren't as set in their ways. And so let's embrace that and make that a real habit so that it doesn't disappear.
Yeah. All right. Yes.
Has your former profession as a lawyer helped or hurt you as a teacher?
I think it's helped me. I certainly love thinking, especially about the constitutional law questions. For example, when I look at this question, I love breaking it down into sort of the constitutional arguments and then the practical, more policy arguments. And so I yes, it has, because I like to really sort of take a question and look at it as a puzzle and try to unpuzzle it.
Yes, in the back.
Do you get the sense that your students have the political views of their parents, or do you think they have their own political views?
Shall I put some of my current and past students on the spot? I won't do that. I would say more often than not, students have a political perspective of their parents. And that's supported by political science data. Most of us have that shared perspective. And I think the data shows that if you diverge from your parents, it tends to happen more after high school. But certainly I have students who are proudly not following their parents. Absolutely, but
Teenage rebelliousness, right?
exactly. But I more often than not, it tracks with what you've grown up knowing in your household.
Yes.
So you're teaching 17 and 18 years, basically. My first part of the question is, how engaged do you really think that they are? And do you think that they are going to register to vote? Because what I've been hearing is that this late teens and early 20s are just not interested in the political process because of what they perceive to be.
This group is highly, I would argue, is highly engaged and highly motivated to participate, but I would also argue that Western Albemarle High School is not representative of America as a whole.
Okay.
And that's just a sad fact, that we are a privileged community, and privileged communities, the term we use in government is politics salient for you. And in certain communities, politics is much less salient. So that's a big part of the challenge. But in my classroom, and it's certainly not that they're all going to go off and study political science in the future, but they seem genuinely interested, especially if I can find ways to make it relevant to their own lives. They get pretty interested in it.
Okay.
What other questions do we have for Walker? Yes, Aaron.
So there's a term, I'm sure you're probably familiar with it, it's called snowplow parenting.
Snowplow parenting.
You know about that? So it's basically, especially at younger ages, where a lot of parents today want to remove all obstacles for their kids so that everything becomes such an easy path forward. And you're now teaching these kids that are 16, 17, 18 years old. And I just wonder if the early parenting of these kids that remove all obstacles impacts the way that they interact with your class.
Remember, you have lots of parents here.
One
Tread lightly.
one way, right, and I'm a parent too. And
I'm a boomer. We didn't screw up my kids.
I mean, one way I could answer your question is, at least from my own perspective, when I became a parent, and certainly when I had kids in early elementary, I kind of thought, well, why isn't there a class about how to be a parent? Because nobody really instructs you how to do it, and so you tend to follow the crowd or whatever in your community is sort of the parenting norm. So I do think sometimes in our community, parents can be challenging for teachers. And sometimes it works in an amazing way as raising a child as a village. But if I were starting from scratch, I'd find a way to have more education for parents. To kind of talk in a concrete way about how can you support both your student but also the school in what they're doing.
All right, one more question for Walker. Yes.
Hi, I'm just curious if you have any advice for parents of children that aren't yet ready for your classroom but are starting to form their own political ideas, and how to cultivate that debating, healthy arguing kind of sense of environment for your child that's on the younger side.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, have the discussions around the family table, and start that practice of, okay, let's what's your initial response to this question, and then let's think about it from the perspective of someone who would disagree with you. So start it as a family practice. There's in terms of, there is a magazine that our family just loves. It's called The Week Junior. And there's the week, and then there's the Week Junior, and the Week Junior is for elementary age kids. And they do a really wonderful job of framing issues and getting kids thinking. So if there's a specific resource, it would be that magazine. I'm also, all of us are too addicted to our screens. So I think a magazine subscription for a young kid is one of the absolute best things that you can use. So that they sit there and look through the old-fashioned magazine.
Justin, can I throw in?
Sure, yeah, one last.
One thing that disturbs me or concerns me is the amount of the politician saying, you lied, you lied. And that's not the truth, you lied. And I'm curious how that is affecting the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old when they hear it. When you have an honor system at Western, and we adults are saying, that person lied. And how does that come across in the classroom? Is that a,
Right. Well, I guess I feel like when I'm trying to nurture the childlike viewpoint of openness, trust, there's this cross pressure of this sort of who can you trust and you lie. That's one that's, I guess, that is going to need to be, as educators, it's going to need to be our next project, because it's going to become more and more of an issue of sort of who can we trust. And unfortunately, I don't have a short answer for that one. I wish that I did.
but the honor system is honored, assumed as an honor system.
Mhm. Yeah, I hope so. Yes. I think the typical young person wants to do what's right. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Walker, for being with us and for the stimulating conversation. See all the young people here. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.